Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Thursday everybody. This week the annual Gaokao or college entrance examinations are underway in China. Here is an example of a question from the Beijing test provided by the Ministry of Education. Question. The term endurance originally referred to continuous navigation, but today it has been endowed with new meanings, such as sustaining youth, technology and fueling economic development, etc. In no more than 700 characters, please write a persuasive essay titled Endurance. This year, a record 12.9 million students are taking the grueling examination across the country. Best of luck to them. First up for today's video, however, we start with the May trade data, which were published yesterday. And just as we've seen in the previous few months, the numbers, at best, can be described as mixed. According to the official data published by the National Bureau of Statistics on Wednesday, and as such we take them with a grain of salt, China's trade surplus shrank 16.1% in May. Chinese exports contracted more than expected in May on weaker global demand for the country's goods. Exports contracted 7.5% year-on-year to approximately $283 billion, well below analyst forecasts of a 0.4 percentage point fall, according to a poll conducted by Reuters. Imports fell 4.5% to approximately $217 billion, though this was better than the analysts' expectations of an 8% fall. In the first 5 months, the value of China's international trade fell 2.8% year-on-year, with exports inching up just 0.3%. We should note that Julian Evarts-Pritchard, head of capital economics, in a research note yesterday, expressed that accounting for a lower base of consumption from last year and changes in import prices, the May import volumes actually increased 8.5% in seasonally adjusted month-on-month terms, the fastest pace in more than a year. Quote, supporting our view that the reopening recovery remains on track, end quote, though they were less optimistic about exports, writing, quote, with the worst yet to come for many developed economies, we think exports will decline further before bottoming out later this year, end quote. Zhang Zhiwei, president and chief economist at Pinpoint Asset Management, expressed similar sentiment, writing yesterday, quote, the weak exports confirm that China needs to rely on domestic demand as the global economy slows. There is more pressure for the government to boost domestic consumption in the rest of the year, as global demand will likely weaken further in the second half, end quote. Others agree. Quote, China's falling exports and imports in May offer more evidence that weak demand, both from abroad and at home, is crippling the recovery. Bottom line, the data reinforce our view that more policy support is needed, including a rate cut, which we think will be delivered as soon as this month, end quote. US financial media outlet Bloomberg writes today that one sustaining bright spot for Chinese exporters was the, quote, continued strength of global demand for Chinese cars, with total vehicle shipments hitting a record for any single month of $9 billion. One of the drivers for the recent surge in car exports has been the popularity overseas of Chinese electric vehicles, although shipments of other types of cars have also been rising, end quote. Turning now to the bilateral trade relationships specifically, US financial media outlet The Wall Street Journal writes that China's share of trade with the United States has dipped again, continuing a months-long downward trend. China accounted for 15.4% of US goods imports for the 12 months ended May, the smallest share since October 2006. Trade with Japan declined 3.5% year-on-year too. In the first 5 months of this year, the growth rate of China's trade with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the European Union stood at 9.9% and 3.6% respectively. China's trade with Belt and Road countries rose 13.2% year-on-year. And of course, as anticipated, trade with Russia continues to soar. In the first 5 months of this year, January through May, bilateral trade has surged 40% year on year. Russian exports to China is up 20% during the same period, and Russian imports is up a whopping 75% year on year. As we all know, we live in a highly interconnected world where geopolitics and economics cannot be separated. Next up, we explore how Europeans feel about China and whether they would back America in a US-China war. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. Sharing and subscribing is a huge help as well. It's only me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation, so thank you very much. As always, anyone who can go that extra mile and help keep the channel sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. There is also the super thanks function in YouTube itself. As always, thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. The European Council on Foreign Relations recently conducted a large poll of European views on a range of foreign policy questions related to Russia, the US and China. The opinion poll was made across 11 EU member states: Austria, Bulgaria, Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Spain and Sweden, polling over 16,000 respondents. The findings were published yesterday. Within the report, one of the most notable findings on China-related affairs was, quote, Europeans want to remain neutral in a potential US-China conflict and are reluctant to de-risk from China, even if they recognize the dangers of its economic presence in Europe, end quote. Adding, quote, in many ways, European citizens are more on Team Macron than Team von der Leyen. They do not see China as a power that challenges and wants to undermine Europe, and they do not buy into the democracy versus autocracy framework promoted by the Biden administration, end quote. Indeed, one American analyst in response to these findings expressed today, quote, maybe Macron is right, and perhaps the US should not be overly confident that the EU is with us when it comes to China, end quote. However, the Ukraine war and China's Russia policy, specifically its support for Moscow, could be a wild card in European public opinion, as the European Council on Foreign Relations survey report also concluded, quote, however, if China decided to deliver weapons to Russia, that would be a red line for much of the European public, end quote. As we will see too, the European public is also still divided on some views towards China, and there is variation between countries. We should also note that the public views in the UK, a non-EU member, are likely quite different to those of Europeans on the continent. The UK is a much closer traditional military and intelligence ally of the US, and indeed a fellow Anglophone. Its involvement in AUKUS, too, signals a commitment to an Indo-Pacific presence. Now, let us walk through the findings of the European Council on Foreign Relations survey, titled, Keeping America Close, Russia Down, and China Far Away, How Europeans Navigate a Competitive World. We will briefly cover key observations related to China, quoting the survey report directly. 1. 43% of respondents view China as a necessary partner with which Europe must cooperate. 2. Europeans have no doubt that Russia and China are working together on the global scene. On average, 70% of respondents recognize the two as close partners. 3. If Beijing decided to deliver ammunition and weapons to Russia, on average 41% would be ready to sanction Beijing, even if that meant seriously damaging Western economies. A minority of 33% on average would oppose this. 4. On average, a majority would oppose allowing Chinese companies to own infrastructure in Europe, as well as to buy a European newspaper or technology company. The same question was asked in late 2020. Since then, Europeans have grown somewhat more concerned about China's economic presence in Europe. EU views on the US are also important to cover here. We continue to quote the report directly. 5. When conducting our polling in the spring of 2021, Trump's legacy and the images of the Capitol building being stormed by rioters were still deeply ingrained in the minds of the European public. Fast forward to 2023 and the picture is considerably different. Russia's war on Ukraine has seen US leadership return to Europe, and it seems European leaders and publics alike have been more than happy to embrace it. However, 6. The perceived closeness of Europe to the US does not translate into a willingness to support the US against China in a hypothetical conflict over Taiwan. Despite America's involvement in standing up to Russia, few Europeans believe they should return the favor. If a conflict broke out between the US and China over Taiwan, on average, only about a quarter would like their country or Europe to take America's side, whereas a clear majority would like to remain neutral. This may be concerning to some in Washington, but the general trend in this survey is that of increasing concern towards China and renewed confidence in American leadership after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia's conflict in Europe, as well as China's support for her, will continue to play a wild card in just where Europeans stand in relation to the growing US-China conflict. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. I will see you all tomorrow.